In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a man. He was a force of nature. From the shores of Portugal to the plains of Poland, the continent answered to him. Kings were his subjects, and empires were his spoils. He was at the absolute height of his power, the undisputed master of Europe. But one colossal power remained defiant, a sleeping giant in the east: Russia. The feud was not just about territory, it was personal. Tsar Alexander I, once a tentative admirer of Napoleon, had become his greatest rival. The Tsar's refusal to enforce Napoleon's continental system, a trade blockade designed to cripple Great Britain, was a direct challenge to his authority. For Napoleon, this was an insult that could not be tolerated. He decided the Tsar needed to be taught a lesson in obedience. To do this, he would assemble the largest European army in history. It was called the Grande Armée, the Great Army. Over 600,000 men, a river of humanity drawn from 20 nations. There were French veterans, proud Poles seeking to restore their nation, disciplined Germans, Italians, Dutch, and Swiss. They were the best equipped, best led fighting force on the planet. As this monumental army gathered on the borders of Russia in the spring of 1812, the world watched in awe. It was not a question of if Napoleon would win, but how quickly. He was the god of war, and this was to be his final greatest masterpiece. He believed a single decisive battle would bring the Tsar to his knees and secure his dominion over the world forever. He was wrong. On June 24, 1812, under the cover of darkness, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon watched them go, a torrent of bayonets, cannons, and cavalry, convinced he was witnessing the dawn of his ultimate victory. But the enemy he expected to find was not there. Tsar Alexander and his generals, particularly the cunning Michael Barclay de Tolly, had a plan born of brutal pragmatism. They knew they could not defeat Napoleon in a head-on battle, but they had an ally Napoleon did not: Russia itself. Their strategy was simple and terrifying: retreat and scorched earth. As Napoleon's army advanced into the vast Russian heartland, the Russian forces refused to engage. They fell back, and as they did, they destroyed everything. They burned villages, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, and torched fields of crops. There would be no food, no shelter, and no supplies for the invaders. The Grande Armée was marching into an empty, hostile void. The sheer scale of Russia began to press in on the soldiers. The distances were immense, the sun was scorching, and the supply lines, the lifeblood of the army, were stretched to the breaking point. Wagons got stuck on primitive roads. Horses died from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Soldiers, plagued by dysentery and thirst, began to fall behind. Before they had even fought a single major battle, tens of thousands had already perished or deserted. Napoleon's war was not against the Russian army, but against the land itself. By August, frustration in the French camp was mounting. Napoleon desperately needed the glorious, decisive battle he had been promised. The Russian generals, facing immense pressure to stop retreating and fight for their homeland, finally made a stand just 70 miles from Moscow, near a small village called Borodino. On September 7, 1812, the two armies clashed in what would become the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. It was a battle of pure, savage attrition. Napoleon assembled a massive artillery battery and pounded the Russian lines, while his infantry and cavalry launched wave after wave of brutal assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. The Russians, under the command of the old, implacable General Mikhail Kutuzov, fought with ferocious courage. They stood their ground, absorbing horrific punishment, refusing to break. For 12 hours, over 250,000 men were locked in a maelstrom of cannon fire, musket volleys, and bayonet charges. By the end of the day, the fields of Borodino were a human slaughterhouse, covered with nearly 100,000 dead and wounded men. Napoleon had technically won. The Russians retreated, leaving him the field. But it was a victory that felt like a defeat. He had suffered crippling casualties, and more importantly, he had failed to destroy the Russian army. Kutuzov's forces, though bloodied, were intact and withdrew in good order. Napoleon had won a battle, but the war remained stubbornly out of his grasp. After the carnage of Borodino, the road to Moscow was open. Napoleon believed he had finally won. Taking the enemy's ancient capital was the ultimate checkmate. He expected a delegation of city elders to greet him, surrendering the keys to the city and begging for peace. When the Grande Armée reached the hills overlooking Moscow on September 14th, they stared at the city's golden domes with a mixture of awe and relief. Their ordeal, they thought, was finally over. But as they marched into the streets, an eerie silence greeted them. Moscow was a ghost town. Nearly its entire population had fled. That night, the fires began. Set by Russian agents on the orders of the city's governor, the flames spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. For 4 days, a great firestorm consumed Moscow. Napoleon, who had taken up residence in the Kremlin, was forced to flee for his life as the inferno raged around him. His grand prize had turned to ash. He had captured a capital, but there was no government to surrender, no populace to subdue, and no supplies to sustain his army. He sat in the charred ruins for over a month, waiting for a message from Tsar Alexander. He sent peace offers, expecting the Tsar to finally negotiate. But from St. Petersburg there was only silence. Napoleon had marched to the heart of Russia, only to find it had no heart. On October 19th, with no surrender in sight and his army's supplies dwindling, Napoleon had no choice but to order the retreat. He had wasted 5 precious weeks in Moscow, and now his most terrifying enemy was stirring, the Russian winter. At first the weather was mild, but the retreat was already a nightmare. The army was forced to retrace its steps along the same scorched earth path it had taken on the advance. There was nothing to forage. Starvation set in. Soldiers were reduced to eating their dead horses, leather from their saddles, and even, in their desperation, each other. Then, in early November, the first snowflakes fell. Soon it was a blizzard. Temperatures plummeted to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below zero. The cold was a relentless, invisible beast, claiming thousands of victims every night. Men froze to death in their sleep. Frostbite turned hands and feet black. Muskets became so cold they would sear the skin of anyone who touched them with bare hands. Discipline collapsed. The proud Grande Armée dissolved into a desperate, shuffling mob of starving, freezing specters, their only thought on survival. They were no longer fighting for an empire. They were fighting the land, the cold, and their own despair. Napoleon's once mighty army was being devoured by an enemy he could not see and could not fight, General Winter. As the frozen remnants of the army stumbled westward, they were relentlessly hunted. General Kutuzov's army shadowed them, not seeking a major battle, but allowing the winter to do its work. More terrifying were the Cossacks. These phantom horsemen of the steppe would appear out of the blizzards, striking the weak. And isolated, seizing supplies and vanishing back into the snow, their attacks adding psychological terror to the physical misery. The ultimate trial came in late November at the Beresina River. The half-frozen river was the last major obstacle, but the Russians had destroyed the bridges and were closing in to trap and annihilate what was left of the army. In one of the greatest feats of military engineering and courage, Napoleon's Dutch pontoon bridge builders, working in lethally icy water, constructed 2 makeshift bridges. For 3 days, a desperate crossing took place. While Marshal Michel Ney and his heroic rearguard fought off the Russians, a panicked mob of soldiers and camp followers scrambled to get across. The bridges broke, were repaired, and became a scene of unimaginable horror. Thousands were crushed to death, pushed into the freezing river, or cut down by Russian cannon fire. The army made it across, but the Beresina became a symbol of the campaign's ultimate disaster. Finally, in early December, Napoleon made a fateful decision. Believing the army was lost, he abandoned it and raced back to Paris on a sleigh to save his political power. He left his men to their fate. By the time the last survivors of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the Neman River in mid-December, they were scarcely recognizable as soldiers. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia with such confidence 6 months earlier, fewer than 100,000 stragglers made it out. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The greatest army of the age had been utterly destroyed. The catastrophe in Russia was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. Emboldened by his defeat, the nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, rose up and joined Russia and Britain in a new coalition against him. The war would continue for another 2 years, but he would never recover. He was now fighting a defensive war, constantly short of trained men and horses, the best of which lay frozen in the Russian snow. The invasion of Russia was more than a military blunder. It was an act of supreme hubris. Napoleon, the master of the battlefield, had underestimated his enemy. He failed to comprehend the will of the Russian people, the cunning of their generals, and the sheer brutal power of the landscape itself. He had marched into Russia as the master of Europe. He left it as a man whose empire was beginning to crumble, a legend undone not by a great army, but by a vast and frozen wasteland.